Horror fans, cinephiles, and Giallo enthusiasts, lend me your ears. This is your host, the King in Giallo, and on our journey through the world of Giallo cinema, I realized that we must take a quick detour. Between The Girl Who Knew Too Much and Blood and Black Lace, there lives a Mario Bava Giallo that is too often overlooked. You will likely not find this Giallo in many lists. I certainly haven't, yet this was made the same year as the first Giallo film. How come most people do not discuss it? It's not that it wasn't inspirational, for the film did go on to be a cult classic, considered one of the 100 greatest horror films ever made, inspiring an English heavy metal band to don the US title of the film as their own name, as well as Quentin Tarantino to make a crime version of the film, becoming Pulp Fiction. Perhaps it's because this Giallo in question is not a movie in and of itself, but a short in an anthology movie. Mario Bava's 1963 The Three Faces of Fear, or Black Sabbath. In this video, I will do a brief deep dive overview, then segue into a review and GialliTally for the Giallo short, entitled The Telephone. The overview will be spoiler-free. Enjoy. I will predominantly be focusing on The Telephone, but considerable introduction to the film is in order. The Three Faces of Fear was Mario Bava's follow-up to The Girl Who Knew Too Much, filmed at the end of its production in an 8-week period. It is a horror anthology film containing 3 segments with bits in between and bookending the episodes narrated by horror icon Boris Karloff. Mario Bava rarely spoke well of his own work, but he often said this film was his favorite one he directed. Quote, "I'm especially interested in stories that focus on one person. If I could, I would only tell such stories. What interests me is the fear experienced by a person alone in their room. It is then that everything around them begins to move menacingly around, and we realize that the only true monsters are the ones we carry in ourselves. Alas, the marketplace demands terrible papier-mâché monsters like the vampire with his sharp fangs rising from his casket." The first half of this quote highlights the shorter segments of the film, The Telephone and Drop of Water. However, the second half of his quote highlights the longest of the 3 segments, The Vergelak. The Telephone was selected by Bava to stand as the modern horror story in the anthology. The opening credits say it is written by F.G. Snyder, but the script was also written by Mario Bava, Alberto Bevilacqua, and Marcello Fondato. In cinema, The Telephone represents both Mario Bava's first Giallo in color, as well as the first Giallo in general in color. Bava emulated the visual styles of Giallo book covers. The tone is far more dark and downbeat, like later Giallo films, unlike Bava's The Girl Who Knew Too Much with its tongue-in-cheek attempts at comedy. The reason why The Telephone is often relegated to the status of being forgettable is once again the fault of AIP's US cut of the film. You see, the original order of the anthology was to open with The Telephone and its sinister yet very plausible plot, followed by The Vergelak, a supernatural tale involving a Slavic vampire, and finally it was to close out with the most memorable and terrifying episode, Drop of Water. This order was carefully crafted to evolve the horror. AIP, ever the experts, deemed no, Drop of Water should be first, then The Telephone, and lastly The Vergelak. Their thinking being that American audiences would stay in their seats for the final episode featuring Boris Karloff. If you've seen Drop of Water, you may know what a mistake it is to open the anthology with the strongest segment rather than close out on it. The Telephone as a follow-up comes off as very lackluster. And again, AIP rescored the original Italian soundtrack by Roberto Nicolosi for Les Baxter. The new score would play non-stop and thus drown the intense ambient sounds crafted by Bava. And again, AIP would administer harsh cuts and revisions to the script in defense of their American matinee audiences. The Telephone would be the main one affected by this. The mature thriller with erotic undertones would be refashioned into a mediocre ghost story with an underwhelming ending. I believe it is this reason that most people do not realize The Telephone is a giallo. I own Black Sabbath, and while my DVD does include both the Italian and US cuts with the correct order and the new order, I had only seen the US cut of things until very recently. My impression of Black Sabbath was always, well, I like the first segment, but the two supernatural episodes are flat compared to the first one. I had the opportunity to finally watch the Italian version, and indeed, the order makes the film better by degrees, and The Telephone is undoubtedly a giallo short. Bava uses the lighting and color palettes to masterful effect. Rosie, the main girl, has bold red lipstick and nail polish, something that would be used throughout Blood and Black Lace. And while The Telephone is not thought of as the best segment, or even completely logical throughout, it shows the giallo film maturing with an emphasis on sex and duplicity, paving the way for erotic thrillers of Umberto Lenzi, and the vivid colors and morally compromised characters would bridge the way to Blood and Black Lace. The film opened in Italy on August 17th, 1963, and only made about $65,000 US, barely more than half of the film's budget. The US version, Black Sabbath, named to connect it with Bava's previous, Black Sunday, opened on May 6th, 1964 on a double bill with The Evil Eye, AIP's US cut of The Girl Who Knew Too Much, and had struck modest success with $419,000, less than 2/3 of the earnings of Black Sunday. Black Sabbath has endured as a horror cult classic, and especially a classic of Italian horror. The telephone segment is usually considered the second best or the worst, depending on which cut you see, as critics generally agree that AIP botched the episode. For this video, however, I will be reviewing the Italian cut. Spoilers ahead. I'll rush through the previewing cliches. The repeat offenders are 1 point for actor, 3 for writer, 3 for composer, and 5 for director. Milo Casada, Mario Bava, both writer and director, and Roberto Nicolosi all worked on The Girl Who Knew Too Much. There are unfortunately no points for the title. First look, we have 25 points for the Italian director, an additional 15 points for the influence bonus of this being a proto-giallo. Look at that! It is plot o'clock. The film opens with a shot on a telephone in an apartment, and before the first credit, she starts ringing. We'll go right ahead and give T is for telephone right here, 5 points. And I'll give art contained in the film for another 5 points right off the bat. The home decor is filled with statues, paintings, and simply put, is gorgeous. Makes you wonder if the person living here isn't a set dresser. The phone stops and our main girl enters. This is Rosie, played by Michelle Mercier. Rosie seems to be getting home from work and she's preparing to relax for the evening, but the phone begins ringing again. No one there. She continues getting undressed from the day, but the phone rings again. No one there. As you were, Rosie. The music goes from thriller to jazzy real quick. Just as, you guessed it, the phone starts ringing. We hear a man's voice. He begins harassing Rosie, seemingly spying on her in real time. He claims he will kill her. Q is for questions, 5 points. Rosie hangs up. Rosie has a cigarette and waits for the phone to ring. I said this one is usually a given, so F is for fashion, 5 points. Z is for zoom, 5 points. Before long, she begins to pull the covers from the bed, but everybody, the phone rings. The caller asks why she changed into her robe. He threatens again and now alludes to revenge before referencing Rosie's turning on the lights. Visibly distraught now, Rosie makes herself a drink. Footsteps are heard outside her apartment, headed in the direction of the door. Rosie attempts to make unlocking the door impossible and then turns out some lights. She hides a few valuables and some cash. Rosie takes the phone and prepares for the next call. A sound is heard. Rosie takes the phone, but it suddenly rings, scaring her and causing her to drop the phone. The caller's voice is heard, and he says her hiding her valuables is idiotic because he's already said that he wants to kill her and nothing else. Woman is called an idiot, 3 points. Rosie begins pleading with the man, dare I say, yelling? Hell, let's do it. Y is for yelling, extra for hysterical woman, 10 points. Extra points for Q is for questions, as we have questions being yelled. Another 5 points. The camera pans to the window and we get a wonderful crash zoom on a pair of eyes. Extra 5 points for a zoom on eyes, and E is for eyeballs, 5 points. And V is for voyeur, 5 points. Footsteps are heard outside the door. Rosie goes to the door and listens, then notices a letter has been thrust under the door. It is a newspaper clipping saying, "Frank Rayner has escaped." I thought his name was DeVico. Phone rings again. Rosie answers and the caller resumes the cat and mouse game. He drops a bombshell on Rosie, that calling the police is useless because he will just kill her before they get there. Again, this should have all been implied by his spying. Rosie dials, and a woman answers on the other line. Mary, played by Lydia Alfonsi. Mary asks what happened to Rosie not wanting to speak to her ever again. Rosie tells Mary that Frank has escaped, but she knows. Mary asks if this means that the two of them will get back together. Rosie pleads for Mary to come over immediately. Mary agrees and says, 5 minutes. The phone rings as soon as she sets it down and we receive a twist. The caller is in fact Mary.
Well, okay, then who was outside?
Mary tries to quote Evil Dead 2, but it's clear that she hasn't seen the movie in a while because that's not the line. I'll go ahead and slap on L's for lies, 5 points. Rosie is terrified, but a knock at the door and Mary's voice is all that is needed for now to assuage her. Mary talks and alludes to the two of them having been lovers. Queer characters, 5 points. Rosie tells Mary about the phone calls. Mary creeps behind Rosie. G is for gloves, black gloves, extra points, 10 points. Mary assures Rosie that everything will be fine and tomorrow they will go to the police. I'll say Mary fits the bill, so we'll say O is for obsession, 5 points. K is for knife, knife reflects the light, and a zoom on a knife, all in one. That is 5 points times 3 for 15 points. Why did she pull the spoon out? Mary sets the knife under Rosie's pillow, instructing her to use it if Frank shows up. Bareback, N is for nudity. I'm going to say no. These movies can get downright pornographic, so let's not get crazy with that cliche. Mary makes a sedative for Rosie so that she can easily fall asleep. 5 points. If only Rosie still had her drink, she could have gotten double that. It becomes night through a simple but great transition. Pan to Mary writing a letter for Rosie. She admits in the letter that it was her all along and that she desperately wanted to see Rosie again and had the idea after reading about Frank's escape. S is for secrets, sure, 5 points. The camera slowly zooms on the door and we get focus on a door handle as it opens and someone creeps in. 5 points. The man stalks behind Mary, unseen and unheard. 2 points for framing and editing to hide the killer's identity. The man, ungloved by the way, picks up one of Rosie's stockings, or pantyhose, or whatever those are, and strangles Mary to death. Odd choice. I would have used one of the many blunt statuettes adorning the apartment. Wham, bam, thank you ma'am. It would have been worth more points too, but the assailant does get 3 points for a stylistic kill bonus for garroting or strangling with an object. It is revealed to be Frank. Well, duh. I will not give this hidden identity until the end, because we basically knew it was him. I know, but come on. It could only be him. What was it gonna be, a complete stranger? Anyways, Rosie wakes up to the sound of Mary being strangled and falling to the floor.
Bludgeoning would have been better.
Frank notices Rosie and approaches her. Frank looks hell-bent on killing Rosie. I can only assume that she was the one who tipped off the authorities in Rome about his smuggling operation. I'll give an extra 5 points here for O's for obsession because the killer is clearly obsessed. Rosie stabs Frank and his fall seems to almost suggest a slasher-type jump scare. But no cigar. Frank is actually simply dead. 5 points for a knife kill. The killer is killed by someone. 10 points. The movie ends with Rosie alone in the apartment, weeping as the camera pans over to the dead body of Mary. Post-viewing cliches. Reasons for the killing. Funny enough, Frank never mentions he wants Rosie dead for revenge. That was always Mary on the telephone. Well, whether revenge or obsession, both are worth 7 points. There is no reason for the investigation because we do not have a sleuth. We don't have an investigation. Bonus points. For the style bonus, we have our first POV in a Giallo. Crash zooms, wonderful use of color and accent lighting, but that's about it. Bava seems to abandon his rack-focused dissolves, and there are no other film effects to mention. Honestly, it could be said that The Girl Who Knew Too Much is actually the more stylistic of the two, considering it does more with the black and white. But this one does resemble a Giallo paperback, if nothing else. I'll make it close. The telephone gets 11 points, where 25 was the possible max. The soundtrack is jazzy, and I'll say better than that of The Girl Who Knew Too Much, 15 points. There are no bad effects in the film, so no points there. Lastly, extra points. The Deadpool awards 10 points per kill or dying person seen, and we have 2 kills on screen. Mary, 10 points, and Frank, 10 points. Red Herring Bucket, for the legitimate suspects, awards 5 points for each, and this is kind of tough for me to decide on. I could say none, or I could say 2, Mary and Frank. I will say 2, because upon first viewing of this, you could speculate that Mary and Frank are working together to entrap Rosie, kind of like the Gialli of Umberto Lenzi, which was inspired in part by this short. So, Mary and Frank, 5 plus 5, 10 points. There are no flashbacks and no nudity, so no more points. Ladies and gentlemen, for the A to Z Giallo film cliches, we have a base score of 12 out of 26. With the bonus points for these, we have a modified score total of 95 points. And for the full GialliTally score, I award the telephone a GialliTally score of 254 points total. So, between The Girl Who Knew Too Much and the telephone, The Girl Who Knew Too Much is in first place for the most points, and the telephone is in last place for the least amount of points. But you know, the telephone was only about 25-30 minutes, and I guarantee if it was 3 times as long, it probably would have gotten way more points, and probably more points than The Girl Who Knew Too Much. But anyway, stick around in the future, because as we tally more Giallo films, we'll see how high these scores really go. I actually don't have a script for this, I'm just going to freestyle. I like the telephone. It's fine. It does its job in a very short amount of time, and I mean, it's not stellar, it's not amazing, but I like it. It's fine. It honestly kind of reminds me of a script that I would write if I was trying to make a Giallo for the stage. It really does come off as something I would have written. It's kind of sad that myself, and I'm going to assume most people, have only seen the Black Sabbath cut of the movie, the US cut, because the change of the order for the drop of water first, the telephone second, and the Virgil act last, it really does fuck up the movie. And the AIP American cuts don't help at all. This is just one of those examples of US distributors thinking they know how to make something better than someone who's not American, and them majorly dropping the ball. Go ahead and watch The Three Faces of Fear, which would be the Italian cut of the movie. It's so much better. It's way better. You start with the telephone, which is a good little short, is a little Giallo. US version of that one, they turn it into a ghost story, which is the main reason why I never considered this as a Giallo. And I actually completely forgot this short even existed, because I've seen Black Sabbath a couple times, but I never really remember it, because Drop of Water really is the best segment, especially when you're watching the US cut, and the other two are kind of trashed. But when you watch the Italian version, you start with the telephone, then it segues into the Virgil act with Boris Karloff, and then you get Drop of Water, which is really one of the greatest shorts in a horror anthology ever. And that's about it. Those are my thoughts on it. It's very decent. Please like this video, share it with your friends if they are horror fans or cinephiles, and subscribe to The King in Giallo if you haven't yet. And if you have any questions, thoughts, curiosities, or concerns, leave those below in the comments section and I will get back to you. Give The King in Giallo a follow on Instagram and a like on Facebook. Next on The King in Giallo will be the overview for Blood and Black Lace. Thank you very much for your continued support. This is Tanner Leeser for The King in Giallo, and if nothing else, I'll see you next time.